The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Cultural Witness from the Midst of Conflict.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 264 of Created in the Image of God. I can't help but repeat those numbers because I'm so pleased with the fact that we've been able to not only carry on with the show and grow it, but manage to attract ever more interesting, educated, and challenging in the best kind of way guests to our show. And tonight's guest is certainly an example of that. His name is Vinoth Ramachandra, and he hails from Sri Lanka. He is a theologian, a writer, and international lecturer who has spent decades helping Christians engage the university and public life with intellectual rigor, something near and dear to my heart. And also, of course, social integrity. He's trained in nuclear engineering at the University of London, but he returned to Sri Lanka rather than continuing to work abroad so that he could accomplish the goals of helping build an interdenominational Christian university ministry. He also served on the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, which was founded in 1946 at Oxford, on their senior leadership team as Secretary for Dialogue and Social Engagement. He's the author of books as well, including Gods That Fail, Subverting Global Myths, and Sarah's Laughter, where he brings theology into conversation with global politics, doubt, suffering, and hope, challenging Western assumptions, and calling the church to a holistic, globally aware discipleship. Let's welcome Vinoth to the studio.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. Good morning, I must say, given the time difference. And we appreciate you getting up early to be with us this evening on our end.
It's my pleasure. Good evening to you.
Well, as we always like to do on this show, we like to give the audience a chance to get to know the real you, which means going way back, talking about your parents, a little bit about your childhood, your upbringing, and the forces that shaped you. And I think in your case, this is particularly important, given that some in our audience are probably quite unfamiliar with the situation in Sri Lanka, the geopolitical perspective that provides you as you look at the questions that we all face as human beings, but coming from a very different and unique vantage point.
Yes, well, I was born and grew up in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is a very rich history. We are home to all the major religious traditions of the world. The majority, something like 65%, would call themselves Buddhist, and they speak a language, Sinhalese, which is only spoken in Sri Lanka, nowhere else. The second largest minority group is Hindu, and they speak a different language, Tamil. So Christians are both Sinhalese speaking or Tamil speaking. There's also a significant Muslim community comprising about 10% of the population. And then we have a very rich, I would say, colonial history, because we were occupied by the Portuguese in the 16th century, who came for the spices. And that's what most of the European colonial empires came to Asia for. And then the Portuguese were displaced by the Dutch. And then the Sinhalese kings invited the British from India to come and help them fight off the Dutch, which the British did. in the 1790s, and then they took over the whole island and ruled till 1948, when we got our independence. So it's a very rich history. So I grew up learning a lot about European history as well as Asian history. My father came from a nominal Hindu background. My mother was a nominal Christian, occasionally going to church. I used to read quite widely as a schoolboy in all sorts of subjects. My first love was physics, but I also read a lot of history and English literature. I seriously began to read the New Testament at the age of 17. Basically fell in love with the person of Jesus. I found him so different to the religious people that I knew, whatever tradition they came from. I thought most of them are just hypocrites, or they live lives that are very boring. I found Jesus quite an exciting figure. I loved his humor, his wit. I loved the things he said against the religious leaders, the establishment of his day. And I just remember just before my 18th birthday, just kneeling by my bedside and I saying, I believe that you're risen from the dead, you're alive, I want to give you my life. I didn't really know any committed Christians my own age at the time. But I wanted to go and have my college education in Britain because I thought Sri Lanka is intellectually, it's a bit stifling. It's like living in a little village. And all my reading exposed me to Europe. So I went to the University of London. I spent 7 years there, specializing in nuclear engineering. I wanted to do physics, but my father advised me to do engineering, saying you have a better chance of getting a job, there's more prestige. And like a good Asian kid, I followed my father. But I realized that I didn't think as an engineer. I was more abstract, theoretical in my thinking, and I continued to read widely, adding theology and philosophy. So after my studies, when I was doing some postdoctoral research, I'd come with the intention of following an academic career either in Britain or in the United States. But my reading in scripture, my reading in Christian theology forced me to think about, how could I, from a poor country, settle down in the rich West to make the rich richer and the powerful even more powerful? Because I came across the God of justice in the Bible, the God who takes the side of the widow, the orphan, the alien, which was a radical new idea for me as a young Christian. And so before I made any serious decision about applying for university teaching positions in the West, I thought I'll take a year off, just go back to Sri Lanka, just see what was happening in the country, what was happening in the universities. And that was a change of direction in my life. So you want me to continue, or do you have more questions on what I've shared so far?
No, that's a wonderfully succinct and yet rich summary. Really helpful. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you mentioned that you came from a nominally Hindu and nominally Christian background. And my question is, given these rather large religious minorities, right? So first you mentioned that Buddhism is the majority religion, followed by Hinduism, and then Islam, and then also Christianity. Is it usual that there are nominal believers, or are most of them more fervent? What is the total percentage, would you say, of religious observance, or at least adherence by name? Because here in the West, as you know, increasingly there are fewer and fewer people who declare to belong to a faith tradition. And many of those who do, they are nominal in the West. Is that usual in your area?
Well, religious observance would be quite common, but that doesn't mean that people really understand what they're doing.
Right.
And even with the Christian community, 7% would be Roman Catholic, and that's largely because of the Portuguese influence. They sort of mass baptized a lot of fishing villages on the west coast. And so you get in the Roman Catholic Church some really outstanding theologians, but the majority of Roman Catholics would be just following folk, I guess what we call folk religion, which is not very different to folk Buddhism or folk Islam. So it's very hard to deduce who actually is a genuine follower of their particular religious tradition.
Well, and I guess
I'm grateful. I grew up in a school. It was a Christian school founded by Christian missionaries, but my classmates were all mostly Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim. Christians were a minority. So I'm very grateful for that experience, growing up with people from very different traditions.
Well, and I'm also trying to sort of get a sense of whether Sri Lankan society is heavily influenced by religious belief, right? Where that enters into society and even politics.
Well, it is, and that has been, I think, the bane of Sri Lankan politics since independence, because the Sinhalese Buddhist majority have always seen Sri Lanka as an island sacred to Buddhism, because when Buddhism died out in India, it was birthed in India, but eventually died out. Sri Lanka became the missionary center for the spread of what's called Theravada Buddhism to Southeast Asia. So they've seen Sri Lanka as a Buddhist country, and that Hindus, Muslims, and Christians are here as our guests, but the constitution gives pride of place to Buddhism. So it's always been expected of kings and now governments that they will honor and support the Buddhist monks and Buddhist institutions. And that has been the source of conflict since independence, and it's still not being resolved.
Well, and we'll get into that as we move into the next segment of the show. So thank you for laying that groundwork. One other question I had is simply, is there nuclear energy in Sri Lanka, or were you, when you were studying nuclear engineering, was that something you planned to do in the West? Or what were your thoughts on how to use that degree before you then made a turn and went in a different direction?
Yes. Well, you see, as I developed a deep sense of social justice as a student, I began to question whether nuclear power was relevant to developing countries like Sri Lanka. So when I returned to Sri Lanka and decided to stay and not go back to the West, when the government at the time, we are thinking of the late 1980s, wanted to buy a nuclear power station from General Electric in America, or Westinghouse, I can't remember which. I wrote some articles in the newspapers challenging that decision and explaining why I didn't think it was a relevant technology. And so they appointed a presidential commission to look into it, and I was asked to come and give evidence. And I remember them saying to me, "You're the most highly qualified nuclear engineer we have in the country. Why are you opposing it? You have so much to gain." And some of the arguments that I brought up didn't make sense to them. They were economists, they were physicists, because I said, look, where you don't have a transparent government and a free media, whenever there is radioactive leakage or a major accident, it's going to be hushed up, like what had happened just a few years ago in Chernobyl in 1985. So we don't have transparent government. We are an autocratic government. We don't have a free and responsible media. So in that context, I wouldn't recommend a technology like nuclear power. And I also said the way that costs and benefits are distributed is important. And we are an overcrowded island. And even if you site a nuclear power station in a remote part of the island, there are still poor people living there. they're the ones who bear the risks, and they won't receive the benefits, the electricity, that only people in the cities mostly will get. So I said that's an unfair distribution of costs and benefits. And these were novel arguments for them. Eventually, they decided to cancel the project, but I think it was largely because the capital costs were too high, and not because I think my arguments persuaded them.
Well, I'm really glad I asked that question, because now I see, they say the devil is in the detail. In this case, it's the opposite, right? The light was in the detail, because now I see how your affinity to what Jesus is represented as doing in the New Testament, in his context. To me, this is just my comment, you're probably more humble than to accept this viewpoint, but that you were following in his footsteps, that you were carrying on in the same spirit that you had learned from studying his life. And it's highly unusual, as those others were commenting on. You have a lot to gain, right? But what good is it if a man gains everything, for the wrong reasons and with the wrong outcomes? So thank you for sharing that. It really, really does illustrate that point, in my view. We're going to go to a quick commercial break now, which is actually a segue that will showcase you in your current natural element, having made that turn and focused on social justice in the Christian context. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Vinoth Ramachandra here on Created in the Image of God.
Vinoth Ramachandra was born in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and later earned his doctorate in nuclear engineering from the University of London. Following his studies, he chose to return home, where he became part of a growing Christian university movement. Today, he is an international lecturer and writer, known for engaging faith with culture, academia, and public life through his work with IFES. Across continents, he has worked with students, academics, and professionals, helping them navigate complex social and cultural challenges with clarity and conviction. He is the author of Gods That Fail, Subverting Global Myths, and Sarah's Laughter, works that challenge assumptions, confront doubt, and invite a deeper, more thoughtful engagement with the world we live in.
Welcome back. We're here with the man himself, represented in that video with Vinoth Ramachandra. We were just talking about how he returned to Sri Lanka and with a degree in nuclear engineering proceeded to inform his government of why they shouldn't go ahead and build the thing that would have given him a very illustrious and I'm sure profitable career in that country. So a little bit counterintuitive, but true to the spirit of the work that you then chose. So big question to open this up. Well, two parts to this question. So what came next in the steps of returning home and writing those papers and having those discussions? And how did the stance that you took related to the question of a nuclear power plant in Sri Lanka, how did that affect your trajectory?
Well, that decision didn't affect my trajectory because I'd already decided that 1 year was going to be much longer, indefinite, because I came back to a country that was on the brink of civil war. I said that the minority Hindu Tamil community, which is largely in the north and the east of the island, had felt since independence that they had been discriminated against, whereas the Sinhalese Buddhists claimed that, conversely, that they were the people who had been discriminated against under British rule. So there was this conflict. And in 1956, they made Sinhalese the national language. And so the Tamils felt that they were now second-class citizens, and all their political aspirations to form a federal system of government all those failed. And so there arose a guerrilla movement amongst disillusioned young Tamil people, youth, some of whom were university graduates who couldn't get employment. And so they began to attack the Sri Lankan army, who were sent to sort of quell this movement. They also planted bombs in public places. And so that invited indiscriminate retaliation from Sinhalese mobs. And that's the country that I found on returning. And I found that Christian students were also pretty confused. There were Tamil Christian students who asked me questions like, well, we are a separate ethnic community. Lenin says that every ethnic community is a nation and every nation has a right to self-determination. So should we join this Tamil guerrilla movement and fight for our homeland, for a separate state? And those are questions that I had never considered living in England, questions about ethnicity and nationalism and revolution and so on. So it was kind of a aha experience for me. And so I thought I will give myself to helping develop a Christian student movement where I would help Christians who were going into business or even politics or engineering or education, all their different professions, but to learn to think theologically, think Christianly, and somehow influence society, even though they were a very tiny minority. I mean, Protestant Christians in Sri Lanka still remain about 1% of the population. So that is what I chose to invest my life in, investing in these young, thoughtful Christian students, Christian alumni, who would stay in the country rather than fleeing to the West and be like Jesus called us to be, salt and light. Salt to arrest the corruption, the decay, and light to shine into places of moral and spiritual darkness. Sadly, many of them actually did flee to the West. Some of them had to for reasons of safety, but many actually chose to stay. And I'm really impressed by what they're trying to do in the country, because even though the war has come to an end, it came to an end in 2009, a lot of the underlying issues that led to the war have not yet been resolved politically. So there's still tension that occasionally flares up. So what I have discovered is that cultures and religious traditions by themselves don't lead to conflict. It's when a particular culture or a religious tradition claims to be the sole owners of a particular territory, when it becomes a territorial religion, that's when conflict ensues, because then minorities feel that they are discriminated against, they are second-class citizens, they want now a state of their own. That's when conflict flares up.
You've just triggered a thought, and it's the fact that if we go way back in history, even as represented in the Bible among the Hebrew people, and I'm sure this is true outside of that context, people tended to believe that gods were territorial, right? You had the god of the mountain, you had the god of the grove or the lake or the river. You follow me? So
yes.
These gods were imagined to be localized and connected. And then
Yes.
then there came the view, there was what was known as a monolatry in Israel, right? In those days, as you know, even under King David, where they believed that some of these gods would still exist, but that there was one supreme God, right? But the distinction that they brought was that this God was the God of time, not of a localized place here on earth. But I hadn't sort of thought of religions becoming a problem when they vested their belief in a territory. And Jesus himself said, my kingdom is not of this world. I'm just reflecting on your comments there. I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to add to that sort of perspective.
Well, there's a lot there to unpack, isn't there? I mean, beginning even what you quoted Jesus saying before Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." That's. I follow the better commentators who say that Greek word "ek" is mistranslated. It is not of this world, but from this world, because he's saying it derives its authority not from human kings or governments like you, Pilate, do. You get your authority from Rome, from Caesar. My authority comes from God. That's what Jesus is saying. Not that the kingdom of God has nothing to do with this world, but ultimately it's God's authority, not any human authority on which it rests. But coming back to, Hebrew religion, the fundamental, the name of God that is given to Moses in Exodus 3 is I am, or I am who I am. And that also then leads to what the Judeo-Christian tradition calls creatio ex nihilo, that is, creation out of nothing, that God is not another being amongst other beings in the universe, but God is being itself. That's the language that Augustine, Aquinas, many others have used, even Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher, and some of the early Muslim philosophers like Ibn Sina and Al-Ghazali, that God, the creator, is not to be identified with anything in his creation. That's a radical distinction between the creator God, I am, Yahweh, Hebrew, and the rest of us. All of us receive our being as a gift from the creator. And so whenever Israel was tempted to think of Yahweh as a tribal deity and forget that the land was entrusted to them as a trust, and remember the call of Abraham was that through this nation, all the nations would be blessed, that Israel was to live in obedience to Yahweh's law, and so attract the nations to the worship of the one living, true creator God, Yahweh. Israel lost that universal vision, wanted to be just like other nations, and so that's why Yahweh kicks them out of the land. They go off first to Assyria, and then in the 6th century to Babylon. And then when we come to Jesus, we find Jesus himself as the new Israel, the true Israel. And the land is not mentioned anywhere in the entire New Testament, because now it's the whole earth that is holy to God. In fact, this language that so many Christians today use of the Holy Land, referring to the present Palestine or state of Israel, the phrase Holy Land is never found anywhere in the Bible. It's the land, the whole earth, that is holy to God. So I think it is this narrowing of vision that leads to conflict. I think we're being interrupted by some voices. Yeah.
No, that was, I was just listening and drinking it in. Thank you so much for unpacking that and for taking us through that progression. So, as you began to get involved with these organizations like IFES and engaging with student communities, tell us a little bit about some of the topics and the application of the teaching. And I'm also curious, not directly related, but your focus has been in the Christian community. What is the approximate percentage of Christians in Sri Lanka?
Well, Christians only about that is, Protestant Christians about 1%, and Roman Catholics about 7%. But after I began this work in Sri Lanka, this body called the IFES, which is a global umbrella organization that brings together indigenous national university ministries like the one I was helping to form in Sri Lanka, invited me to do what I was doing in Sri Lanka in other parts of South Asia, They said there are already established national ministries in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, but they need someone with your gifts of teaching to deepen them, to equip them, to engage more relevantly to the life of the university and their wider societies. So then I gave IFES 3 months a year for 14 years to doing this. And then in 2001, I came like as full-time as their, and my scope was expanded to cover not just South Asia, but anywhere in the world where any of these they're all independent national movements with their own boards, their own ways of doing things. But if any of them felt they could use me in teaching or in university dialogue events or debates, that they could use me. So that's what I was doing from 2001 until my retirement three years ago. So I enjoyed having a university dialogue event with a person, either a secular, an atheist professor, or a Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, on a topic of shared concern. It could be global warming, it could be human rights, it could be on science, the whole scientific worldview, and questioning one another in a public setting, probing each other to what are our assumptions, presuppositions, and so on. And I think that's the best way to communicate, the way of dialogue, which isn't saying, look, we're all saying the same thing, but in different languages. No, I think that's not true. But even if we disagree, we disagree, having understood each other better and respecting each other.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that unfold in this country, the United States, where there's virtually an ideological civil war going on.
Yes,
that has been going on for the last several decades. And caricatures have been created about the opposing sides. And now people are, fighting the straw men, or using the straw men, to wage ideological warfare. And this idea of understanding is not there. And no, they're not saying the same thing. They're saying the opposite thing. They may actually want, certainly they claim to want some of the same things. Both sides claim that the other side is destroying democracy, for example. So they both claim that they want democracy, right? They might both claim that they want unity, but they want unity their way. So what are some of the ways or opportunities that you've seen and tried to leverage in terms of generating that understanding that's needed on all sides of an issue?
Well, it's very difficult because I cannot reach those, say, in the Christian community, who are, say, so convinced that their position is right and everybody else is wrong. And they have this entrenched sort of persecution complex, even though they may actually be numerically quite large. Just like in Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese Buddhists, or the majority, have what we call a minority complex. They feel threatened, which is, the same thing I feel that some Christian fundamentalist groups in America feel. Even though they are numerically large, they still use the language of persecution. And when you start using that language, it's very difficult to communicate. If you're an outsider, you don't belong to them. And so whether you're Buddhist or Muslim, or if you develop this sort of view that everybody is against us and we have to defend ourselves, and in defending ourselves, we're also defending God. And then God comes into the picture, a nationalist God, a territorial God. Then it's very, very hard to have genuine dialogue. And so I have to trust people who are closer to those people within their communities than I am. and try to influence them so that they can reach those people. I can't.
Well, that's an interesting.
Yes. So my problem with the American church is not with, they say, the MAGA Christian nationalists or the radical, the cultural left Christians, so-called progressives. It's the silent majority of people who may think like I do, but are silent. Their voice is not heard. At least we don't hear their voices. We're only hearing the voices of these extremists. And so it damages also what we want to say in our context in Sri Lanka or in India or in the Middle East or whatever, because people always ask, well, why are Christians like this? And it's very hard to say, well, not all Christians are like this.
Well, exactly. This is what I meant when I said a caricature is created. And I'm reflecting now on something you said earlier, in which the conditions in Sri Lanka were not conducive to a nuclear power plant because there was no transparent press. There weren't, there would be autocratic rule. And it's interesting because in our world here in the United States, I often joke that on the dollar bill, it says, "In God we trust," and there's a missing word. It should, the word "this." In this God we trust, right? In the money we trust. And the reason I'm joking about that now is, economics drives everything. And so we're actually amplifying those differences, amplifying those caricatures, because it's monetarily profitable to create excitement, engagement, anger. So the algorithms that are created feed into these caricatures because it creates profit. It drives the economy, which is fascinating because in a more of a dictator, they're trying to suppress, right, these movements. They might leverage one voice, but they'll try to suppress the other. Whereas here, all sides are being amplified for profit, which is feeding into this view that all Christians think this way, or all MAGA folks think this way, or all blue state people think that way. When in fact, to your point, it's not true at all. But it's the economic motive that's built into communication and media that feeds those caricatures because it makes money.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, social media has, like you said, worsened the situation. And it's very rare to find people who've got friends who are very different to them, friends who have a different color, friends from a different culture, a different religious tradition. So not only on social media and the internet, but also in the physical environment, in the towns or villages that they live, they tend to just huddle together. That's a kind of village mentality, even in the big cities.
So, are you able to highlight maybe a breakthrough or two that you've had over the course of your career where you've overcome the challenges that we're talking about to engender understanding and maybe even progress or change? Are there any examples you'd like to cite?
Well, within the Christian movement that I helped to start in Sri Lanka, I'm grateful looking back that we remained as one movement. We didn't fracture, we didn't fragment. In all our conferences, we provided for translation into the other language. We encouraged debate, sometimes very heated arguments and debate across each other. And so we found people who were willing to change. And some of them, even as they changed, were then ostracized or marginalized by their families and the ethnic community, seen as traitors. It was painful, but I saw that as success. We were not numerically large, but I thought the quality of these people's discipleship is very, very rich and encouraging. But also, I was involved with the civil rights movement, where we also had people from other faith backgrounds. And so we had conversations with people, and they were trying to change the thinking of the wider communities in which they worked. And they saw significant change. Again, numerically, not so much, but I was encouraged to see them also active in local areas as well as on a larger stage, helping bring people together, people who'd lost members of their family either to the Tamil guerrillas or to the army, the Air Force, and actually getting them to talk to each other and see each other as human beings and form a common front, whether it was a mother's front, confronting the government, wanting information about children who disappeared in the war. So I was encouraged to see these initiatives happening. But like I said, they were always minorities, and the majority still remain fairly passive. And it's only when they are affected that they speak out. That's the case, whether in the West or in Asia or Africa. That's human nature.
And you mentioned some of the challenges that those have had who have engaged in the processes or the opportunities that you've provided, and then even become, ostracized, created enemies within their own communities and tribes. What about your own personal experience? Have you faced opposition? Have you faced various ones who maybe tried to, undermine, ridicule, or even stop the work that you're doing?
Well, it began with my own family. Like my father, who encouraged me to do engineering, was very unhappy with my decision to come back to Sri Lanka, and then my decision to leave engineering or an academic career. And we had a rather difficult relationship. He was a surgeon, and he used to boast about me when I was growing up, boast about my school performances to his colleagues. And I remember him saying to me, a few years after I returned, he said, I'm ashamed to talk of you to my colleagues, which deeply hurt me. Mm-hmm. But later we were reconciled. As he began to see the fruit of what I was doing, he met some of the people I had nurtured when they were students, and he was very impressed. And so just before he got dementia at the age of 80, we were reconciled, and he actually became a Christian. So that was very painful. I never received any death threats, but I had people writing to me, even calling me all sorts of things, a communist, a Marxist, everything. And even an army commander who once, his wife was in a church where I was preaching, and he was sitting in his car outside listening. He was a Buddhist. And he called me afterwards, and he cautioned me about saying what I was saying. And I said, I'm very sorry, but I can't stop saying what I'm saying because it's the truth. So, but there are colleagues of mine, people I've worked with, a couple of members of parliament who came out of the university ministry, who have received death threats, even assassination attempts on their lives for what they're doing.
What are your personal views on Marx as a Christian?
Well, in my book, Gods That Fail, I have a chapter on Marx and Marxism. And I point out that actually Marx, until the age of 17, claimed to be a Christian. His father had converted as a Jew. But he wrote a very interesting essay on John's Gospel at the age of 17. But later he saw religion as, what he called the opium of the masses, a kind of a drug. He didn't mean it in a harsh way. He said what it's doing is it's helping people it's helping people compensate for their suffering in this life by promising them, that they will, their fortunes will be better in another life. And so he saw at least the Christianity that he was exposed to at the time, as having that effect. And I think he was right. But his Jewish and Christian background provided the prophetic fire. I mean, why be concerned about the poor? Why be concerned about social justice and equality if you say as an atheist that, well, death is the end, there's nothing beyond death. We all end up in the same place. So then why do we care? And yet people do care. Why do we, believe in, well, he didn't believe in human equality, but at least the equality of the proletariat, the working class, and why did he care so much about that? So you can only understand Marxism as a religious movement, borrowing from the Jewish prophetic tradition, claiming to be a scientific analysis of history. So it attracts people both as a religion and as something scientific. So it's really a secular religion, and that's been the attraction of Marxism.
So, I think this is a good point to go to a quick break. I'm drinking in of all of this, and I'm processing and I'm cogitating on what I'm learning. So we're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, we're going to ask, what next? Where are you growing next? You're relatively recently retired, but I'm sure there are still things that hold your interest, and maybe there are some directions you can point people in who want to know more. We'll go to a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with more of Vinoth Ramachandra on Created in the Image of God.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth: God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
So I've been involved in the publication of that book through the Royal Falcon Foundation. And in the preface or the introduction, we say something very similar to what you said. We're not saying that this book is trying to erase the differences between these texts, but it is about understanding what they actually say and where they're actually coming from. And we want to talk a little bit here as we conclude the program about how people can engage with your work, with the ideas. But I guess I do have that one last question is, or maybe it's in that context. What would you envision for a future for Sri Lanka? How would things need to structurally change, or what changes would you envision that would facilitate greater understanding between these religious traditions and what they represent to the various population groups within Sri Lanka?
Yes, well, before I answer that, I think where I would disagree with the clip that you just showed is I don't think that there is an ultimate unity in the sense of religious unity. I think our unity is that we are all, like you say, created in God's image. But that's not a belief that most people actually share. Certainly not people who believe in the caste system in India. And historically, it comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's not that we're all climbing up the same mountain. We're just on different slopes. I would say we are climbing up different mountains. Even the ultimate destiny, salvation, as understood by the different faiths, is different, but that doesn't mean that we cease to be in God's image and that we're equally valued and loved by the Creator God. And so we relate to each other not on the basis of those religious paths that we follow, but on the basis of the fact that we are created in God's image and have things to learn from one another, whether it's our religious traditions or culture or anything else, even our economic situations. So I envisage for Sri Lanka a genuinely pluralist society where no one religious tradition is treated as somehow superior, that receives special favors from government. To me, a secular government is one like in India, at least in theory, in the Indian constitution, where the government treats all different religious communities impartially. We know in practice that's not happening because Hindu nationalists have more or less taken over the Indian state, just like Christian nationalists are attempting to do in the US, or it's happened in Russia. So that is my vision of a genuinely pluralist state, but also economically one that actually promotes justice for the poor, that sees the provision of healthcare and education, affordable healthcare and affordable education as a fundamental human right that follows from treating each person as having a unique human dignity because they're made in God's image. In theory, we have free healthcare in government hospitals, but it's becoming less free because even those hospitals are charging people for certain medicines. There's also a growth of private medicine, which is taking doctors away from the state-run hospitals into private medicine. And so these are things that I would like to see reversed. So maybe more a Scandinavian model where the best healthcare is provided for by public hospitals and where people only go to private hospitals for minor ailments.
Well, of course, with a name like Franson and having lived in Sweden, I appreciate that. I went to school 4th, 5th, and 6th grade in Sweden. And back in that day, Sweden prided itself on being something that was called the humanitarian superpower. I am curious when we start talking about healthcare, affordable healthcare being a right, a human right. The challenge, of course, is that it doesn't exist without the efforts and labor of people, right? So there needs to be a certain degree of personal responsibility and cooperation in order for that care to be afforded in an affordable manner. You follow me? In other words,
Yes.
if you have a majority of people who think that it's their right, but they don't have a responsibility to contribute to the society's ability to provide that right, then the whole thing falls apart.
Well, yes, but when I say it's a human right, I should have qualified it by saying it's a derivative human right. The fundamental right is a right to life, but it follows that if I have a right to life, I have a right to the means to sustain life, and that's where affordable healthcare comes in. And I think where the National Health Service in Britain or other countries, while I highly respect it and would still recommend it universally, where it's gone wrong is they should be charging people who can afford it to make a greater contribution to the National Health Service and not give them free medicines if they really can afford it. But remember that every single person actually pays taxes. Even the poor are paying taxes. They pay taxes on the goods that they purchase, what we call value-added tax. I don't know what
Sales
translates
tax.
to
We have sales tax here.
sales tax, yeah.
Yeah.
So everybody, including so-called undocumented immigrants, are all paying taxes. So it's not fair to say that people should, are just sponging on the system, when actually the system is benefiting from their taxes and the work that they're doing. And during the COVID pandemic, I mean, many of us were so dependent on the people whom we normally just ignore. The truck drivers, the farmers, the garbage collectors, the nurses, the hospital attendants, the mortuary workers, even the grave diggers, the invisible people. And they're the people who helped keep us alive during the pandemic when everything was shut down. And yet now we've gone back to ignoring them, treating them as, undesirable sponges of the system, and just catering to the rich, many of whom don't pay tax, especially in the US, where their wealth is not taxed, many of the tech billionaires. So that's the hypocrisy. And we see this increasingly globally, including in Sri Lanka.
So are there,
corruption.
You've got those 3 books that you've published.
Actually, there's 7 books. I published 7 books altogether.
All right.
You mentioned 3, but Subverting Global Myths, sadly, is no longer in print. The other 2 are, but there are 4 others, and I've got chapters in other people's books.
Are there any particular ones that you'd like to highlight that people could go to look at this, that, or the other topic of interest?
Well, Sarah's Laughter was my last full-length book, and that deals with the whole question of suffering and evil, lament. I wrote it after my wife died of cancer, but I've been speaking on lament, which is a common theme in the Bible, particularly the Psalms and the prophetic writings of God himself lamenting over his world, and then we lamenting in prayer, protesting to God about injustice and God's apparent silence in the face of horrific evil. So that lament tradition has been part of my prayer life even before my wife fell ill, lamenting over what was happening in the world. And so whenever I spoke on that, people said, why don't you write? Because we don't hear about this in our churches. It's all sort of jolly songs of praise and thanksgiving, but not about protest and lament, tears. So I would begin there. It's a fairly small book, and it's available either or as an e-version. There's a book that came out last month.
Could you just repeat the title? Could you repeat the title of that one more time?
Sarah's Laughter. This is Sarah, who is the wife of Abraham. And remember how she laughs when she hears God promising Abraham that she, even though she's old in years, that she is going to bear a child, and she laughs cynically, in doubt, questioning God. And then later, there's another place when she laughs, and that's laughs tears of joy when the promise is fulfilled. And so I've subtitled the book Doubt, Tears, and Christian Hope, and basically arguing that until we go through the first kind of tears, Sarah's tears of doubting, unless we move through that experience, we will never enter the experience of Christian hope and Christian joy.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's take a moment to just pull in a couple of audience comments that have been coming in as we've been talking here as we bring this to a conclusion. This first one from early on from Eddie Bear. Jesus is and will always be exciting. Harking back to when you were mentioning your own exploration at 17 of that. And there was a question here that I wanted to just get your take on. This is from Out There 74. I've always heard that Sri Lanka can be dangerous to visit. Yet I've always wanted to see it. Is it true, or is that is that just the locals trying to keep out the riffraff? I don't think that's what it is. But how true is the impression that it would be a dangerous place to visit?
Well, it's just nonsensical. It's much safer than the United States, most American cities. I mean, tourism is our prime industry, and most people don't need visas to come to Sri Lanka. Certainly Americans don't. Whereas we have to go through a very painful process whenever we want to visit the US or Europe of getting visas, which are not very difficult and increasingly difficult under your present government. Yeah, it's perfectly safe. Tourism is our number one income earner. So please come and spend your money.
Thank you so much for clarifying that, for clearing that up. Here we have, when we're talking about people being ostracized, and Go Hawks, obviously a sports fan, that isn't really something new, being ostracized by family, that is, right? This is part of the human condition going way back, right? So does it sometimes feel like we're going backwards, or what's your take on the progression of maturing, or the hope that we will become different in this regard?
I don't know. It's particularly strong in Asian families, where sometimes parents have a very possessive attitude towards their children and try to live their lives through their children. I guess Western societies would be the opposite in many ways, although there are exceptions. So much individualism that children don't feel any connection with their parents or any responsibility towards their parents. So I guess in Western societies, the ostracism is more likely to come from your peers or friends than from your family, as it is in Asian societies.
Well, yeah, and we have that whole political or religious affiliation thing going on, where people have substitute families in their social circles.
Right.
I was reminded actually of a trip that I made to India, Tamil Nadu, where I had a very small, somewhat minor, but nonetheless needed attention medical condition arise. And I was somewhat fearful. But my friend, my guide that was working with me as I was there working on this foundation, took me to a medical facility, and they had to perform a very minor surgery or operation, and it was all free, and there was no discussion of anything, and it happened at a very high level, despite my fear and trepidation. I just bring that up in this context of medical services. How are things in Sri Lanka in that regard?
Yes, well, we have, cutting edge surgical operations being performed in Sri Lanka, because all our consultant doctors, if they do their first degree in Sri Lanka, they get their graduate training either in Britain or in Australia, other English-speaking countries, because the medical education system is sort of follows the British model. And those who do come back to Sri Lanka, many of course don't, but those who do come back are highly trained, and they yes.
Thank you. One last question, and this came into my mind and left, so may not be the best one to conclude on, but I'll just throw it out there. Jesus said things like, "The poor you will always have with you." And he also said things like, "I am not come to bring peace, I am come to bring a sword, and a man's enemies will be those of his own family." Right? So some of these topics of social change, whether it be alleviating poverty, providing quality, low-cost healthcare for all, and even this idea of being socially ostracized. Obviously, Jesus wasn't saying these are preferred conditions, but he was commenting on the fact that they seem to be not only systemic, but part of the, dare I say, status quo. What's your comment on that as a Christian working in this space?
Well, it's very dangerous to take biblical verses out of their context. And the context in which Jesus says those words is to people who are trying to prevent a woman from coming and anointing him with precious perfume. And he's saying, leave her alone, because you will always, because they're trying to say, oh, this could have been sold and given for the poor. Not that they cared for the poor.
Well, in particular, it was Judas who was saying that, right? So not exactly an example of anything positive.
So he's not saying you don't care for the poor. He's saying, look, you can do this tomorrow. But this woman is doing something unique. She's expressing her devotion to me, and you will not always have me.
Right.
He recognizes that I'm on the way to the cross. My time with you is limited. So that is a context in which he says that. So to take that verse out of context and say, oh, well, Jesus says we're never going to get rid of poverty is nonsense. Countries have got rid of poverty, absolute poverty. They've made social progress historically.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked it, and it seems like it was a good one to end on in that sense, that there are answers to these. And again, we opened up with commenting on your work, bringing intellectual rigor into these discussions. And again, you've just provided a great example of that by bringing in that context. Well, we're sadly at the end of our time here. We've actually gone a little over time. My apologies to you if you had pressing matters to attend to this morning. Yeah. But maybe as a retired person, let's go to one more question, because somebody asked about your retirement as well. Let me find it here. And we'll maybe conclude on that one here, and then give you the chance to provide some closing thoughts. Where was it? There are quite a few comments here, and I couldn't get to all of them. Well, anyway, it was something about how have you found retiring? Are you still finding the time and the opportunity to be engaged, kind of thing?
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't have children, so while my friends, my colleagues are all engrossed in the lives of their grandchildren, I continue to do actually a lot that I was doing when I was working with IFES. And that is, I'm mentoring younger scholars, either face-to-face here in Sri Lanka or on Zoom. I have various groups that meet with me regularly, people involved in politics and governance, people involved in education, for example. And I try to sort of nurture their Christian faith and apply it to what they're doing. And I accept invitations to speak in different settings, whether they are non-Christian settings or Christian settings, both within Sri Lanka, but also abroad. And I have enough resources to travel, to cover my costs. So I continue to be quite active. And I write, well, not full-length books, but perhaps articles or chapters in other people's books. So I'm
thank you so much. Thank you so much. What closing thoughts do you have then for the audience tonight?
Oh, I wish I knew you so that I could contextualize what I'm saying. If I knew your background, where you're coming from, it would be easier, but I'm hesitant to give advice.
Well, I'm my personal background and many of the people that at least formed the initial audience when I launched this show, I come from basically a fundamentalist sect, you might say, of Christianity, one that was very much into eschatology, apocalyptic views of where we are at in prophecy, that the world needs Jesus to return to clean up the problems, and so on and so forth. So some of the folks in the audience are coming there, but it's grown, and we have philosophers, we have academics, we have also quite a few people that are in pastoring roles, because we try to educate on how to be more inclusive and work more fully engaged with people that might view things differently than yourself, similar to the work you're doing, but not as focused on that.
Yes, well, what can I say? Just be careful that you don't do what I've seen happening to people who come from that background, and that is then they lurch to the opposite extreme of becoming sort of just syncretistic and wishy-washy without any real clear, firm conviction. So each one has to work out their own convictions, perhaps cherish what you received from the past, but rethink everything in the light of what you think is a new practice, a new thought that you've never considered, which comes from, some source that you've never investigated. That's a fairly general thought I'd leave with you. I can't obviously prescribe any particular path, but I would say, explore more what it means to be made in God's image, and it means to profess that that this world is a creation and not just a chaotic, meaningless, arbitrary mess, which it sometimes appears to be.
Thank you so much, Vinoth. It's been truly an honor and a pleasure, and just fascinating to have you here in the studio this morning. We're going to quickly then conclude with a sneak peek for next week's shows. But I hope that when I extend an invitation to have you come back, which I will do, because I think there's a lot more to unpack, that you'll take me up on it so that the audience has a chance to hear from you again. But thank you so much for the work you've done and for being here this morning.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And everyone stay tuned. And if you wanted to just chat briefly, I'll be still here after this sneak peek, but I'm signing off to the audience with my typical tagline, which is, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you next week. Here's what's coming up.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, July 19th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time. Host Wade Franson interviews Jen Pollock Michelle, author, speaker, and writing mentor. She reflects on desire, time, and the ordinary practices of faith, and how Scripture reshapes the way we see our everyday lives, from longing and limitation to discovering God's story in the beauty of ordinary moments. And then on Tuesday, July 21st at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Brian Adamson, Kingdom business coach and entrepreneur. He explores how faith and business can work together, helping leaders build with purpose instead of striving, from biblical principles and entrepreneurship to creating lasting impact through kingdom-minded leadership. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in the Image of God.